So we kind of know that inflation is the rate of change of prices in an economy, or at least we should know this. So the rate of change is just how fast prices are rising. If prices double every couple of decades, that's okay. If they double every couple of days, well, then you end up just chucking money out of the window. But what is inflation really? Where does it come from? Inflation is like that unwanted house guest who overstays their welcome. At first, you barely notice it. A little price increase here, a slightly costlier coffee there. But before you know it, you're questioning why a loaf of bread costs as much as a small island. And everyone around you is complaining about how things were cheaper in my day. Economists, being the diligent detectives they are, have spent decades trying to figure out why this happens. What causes inflation? Why do prices keep going up? And more importantly, how do we deal with it? The result is a smorgasbord of theories, each offering a unique perspective. Let's break them down one by one and see why inflation can be such a persistent and tricky phenomenon. Let's start with one of the simplest theories: demand-pull inflation. The name says it all. Inflation happens when demand for goods and services exceeds the economy's ability to supply them. Think of it like a concert for the world's hottest band where everyone wants a ticket, but there's only a limited number of seats. The ticket prices skyrocket because people are willing to pay more just to get in. In economic terms, this happens when people are flush with cash, maybe due to higher wages, government spending, or easy access to loans, and they're out there buying more than the economy can produce. Businesses can't keep up, so prices rise. Example: picture an economic boom where unemployment is low, people are earning more, and suddenly everyone's buying new cars, clothes, and houses. That increased demand pulls prices up. On the flip side, we have cost-push inflation. Here, inflation isn't driven by demand, but by rising production costs. Imagine a factory that produces widgets. If the price of steel or energy goes up, the factory owner isn't going to eat those costs. Instead, they'll pass them on to you and me in the form of higher widget prices. Cost-push inflation often happens when there's a supply shock, something unexpected that makes a key input more expensive. A classic example is an oil crisis. When oil prices surge, transportation, manufacturing, and energy costs rise across the board, and businesses adjust their prices upward. Example: the oil shocks of the 1970s sent fuel prices through the roof, which trickled into everything from food to flights. It was cost-push inflation at its finest, or worst. Milton Friedman, one of the most famous economists of the 20th century, summed it up perfectly. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. According to the monetarist theory, inflation happens when there's too much money in circulation. If the money supply grows faster than the economy's ability to produce goods and services, prices inevitably rise. To illustrate, think of money as a watering can and the economy as a garden. If you pour just the right amount, the plants flourish. But if you dump water indiscriminately, you flood the garden. Similarly, when central banks print money to fund deficits or stimulate the economy, they risk inflating prices if the money supply outpaces economic growth. Key concept: the quantity. Theory of money, MV and PQ, links money supply, M, and prices, P. More money without more output, prices go up. Example: hyperinflation in Zimbabwe and Venezuela occurred largely because governments printed too much money to fund spending, eroding trust in their currencies. Next up, we've got built-in inflation, also known as the wage price spiral. It's a cycle, and once it starts, it's tough to stop. Here's how it works. Workers see prices rising and demand higher wages to keep up with the cost of living. Employers facing higher labour costs increase prices to maintain their profit margins. Higher prices lead to even more wage demands, and the cycle continues. It's like a dog chasing its tail. round and round it goes. This is why many economists keep a close eye on wage growth during inflationary periods. Example: during periods of high union activity, workers often negotiate for wage increases tied to inflation, fueling the wage price spiral. The structuralist theory shifts the focus to supply-side issues, particularly in developing economies. Here, inflation arises not from demand or money supply, but from deep-rooted economic inefficiencies, what economists call structural bottlenecks. For instance, if a country relies heavily on agriculture, but faces poor infrastructure, crop failures can lead to food shortages, spiking food prices. Similarly, if industries lack competition, businesses might raise prices without fear of losing customers. Example: in many developing countries, food price inflation occurs because the agricultural sector can't respond quickly to rising demand. Inflation isn't just about numbers, it's also about psychology. According to the expectations theory, inflation can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people expect prices to rise, they act in ways that make it happen. Workers demand higher wages now because they expect prices to increase tomorrow. Businesses preemptively raise prices because they expect higher costs. Central banks work hard to anchor these expectations by communicating inflation targets and proving they can keep prices stable. Example: if a central bank loses credibility, people stop trusting it to control inflation, and expectations spiral out of control. Let's expand on this a bit further, because it is fascinating. This theory says that inflation happens because people think inflation will happen. It sounds almost tautological, doesn't it? I mean, if you and I and everyone else in a country decide that, yeah, prices are going to jump tomorrow, prices today will jump, is a bit wild. But it all makes sense. It's a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but without all the goat sacrifices. When we talked about central banks, we covered the concept of forward guidance, which was a complicated way of saying that central banks try to manage people's expectations. So how do they do this? Since central banks have a really large toolkit that keeps getting larger, they can really supercharge their inflation fight. But it's a game of chicken with the rest of the economic actors. If they do everything in their arsenal, everyone knows things can get bad, like if the central bank says they will increase the interest rate, whatever amount they need to lower inflation, the economy can tank. So we all ask ourselves the question, will they really? So they need to make sure to tell us that they will indeed do it. So forward guidance is the central bank's way of saying, I super duper swear that I will do that thing that you think I won't do. A good example of this is Mario Draghi's anything it takes statement when he was head of the European Central Bank. If there's enough demand, we can do a video on this. The new Keynesian theory introduces the idea of sticky prices and wages. That is, prices don't adjust instantly to changes in supply or demand. Why contracts, habits, and menu costs, the literal cost of updating prices, cause delays. For example, even if demand suddenly drops, businesses might keep prices the same to avoid alienating customers. This stickiness means inflation can persist even when economic conditions change. We will do a quick video on whether prices are really sticky, as the new Keynesians claim. Tepid spoiler: they kind of are, but not in the ways you think they are. Example: after the COVID-19 pandemic, supply shocks caused prices to rise, but businesses were slow to lower them, even as supply chains normalized. Final thoughts: inflation in the real world. Inflation isn't a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. Sometimes it's driven by demand pull forces, like a booming economy. Other times it's cost-push inflation, caused by rising production costs or supply shocks. And let's not forget the role of expectations and the psychological side of inflation. The challenge for policymakers is figuring out which theory applies at any given time. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, try to keep inflation under control by adjusting interest rates and managing the money supply. But even they can't predict every twist and turn, because economies, like people, are complex and sometimes unpredictable. In the end, inflation is an inevitable part of modern economies. While a little inflation is a sign of a healthy, growing economy, too much can wreak havoc on businesses and households alike. And no matter how much economists debate the cause, one thing's for sure: everyone notices when prices go up. Whether it's your morning coffee or your monthly rent, inflation is a force we all feel, and understanding its causes might just help us make sense of it. Stay tuned, money enthusiasts.